Now, the majority of SQL that you'll write will be things like select statements, inserts, updates, and deletes, but that's not the whole picture. These keywords are sometimes lumped together as the DML part of SQL. DML standing for Data Manipulation Language, and that's an impressive sounding phrase for something that's really not all that important a distinction. It simply means that part of the SQL language that deals with working with and manipulating data in your table. So selecting it, inserting it, updating it, deleting it. But none of these words actually allow us to alter the structure of the database itself. So how do we create a new table? How would we say what columns exist? How would we define primary keys? We can't use any of these words for that. But that can be done in SQL using a part of the language that is lumped together under the phrase DDL, or Data Definition Language. And the three keywords there are create, alter, and drop. And these words let us change the structure of the database itself. Let's take a look at a couple of them. If I want to write SQL to create a new table, this is the format that I'll use. The word create, and then the table name. You just make it up. It's whatever you want to call it. And then in parentheses, the definition of your columns. This is, after all, what a table is. It's simply naming the columns and giving them data types and any rules they must comply to. So if I wanted to create a new employee table, I'd say create employee. And then inside parentheses, here's how I would provide column definitions. We start off with employee ID as an integer, which is primary key, and these are keywords we're using to tell SQL the importance of and the rules that these columns must comply to. I'm not going to get into the specifics of these for reasons I'll cover in just a moment, but the general format should be at least understandable about what this would do. It's going to create a new table with 5 columns, an integer, 3 varchars, and that means a variable length character field. I can recognize even phrases like not null or null, so it looks like we don't have to put anything in the department column, and then we're finishing off with salary as an integer. Now, obviously, in a production database, these can be far more complex than this, but this is the basics of how it's done. Now, if we move on a little bit and realize we need to change the definition of it, we can use the keyword alter. Now, typically, you would alter a table. You'd give it the table name, and then you'd give it a bit of information about what you're trying to change. In this case, I'm saying I'm adding a new column. That column's called email. It's going to be a variable length character string of 100 characters. And if I have a problem with what I created earlier, I can use the last of the 3 keywords, which is drop. And we would simply say something like drop table employee. We wouldn't need any where clauses, any column definitions. We're simply saying destroy the entire table. Again, something to be very, very careful about working with. Now, I wanted to introduce these phrases, but I'm really not going to spend much more time on these words here for 2 reasons. First, many people who work on the actual design and structure of the database will use a visual application like MySQL Workbench or SQL Server Management Studio rather than hand-coding create and alter statements. And second, if you do need to go into more detail, take a look at our SQL Essential training course. It's true that if you're in a database administration role, you might then spend a lot of time with these kinds of data definition statements, create, alter, and drop. But regular day-to-day developers working in these databases typically don't. You shouldn't be spending most of your time changing the definition of the database. You should be spending most of your time manipulating the actual data in it. So that's why we're not going to focus on that. And it's worth mentioning that there are a couple of other keywords in SQL that are typically lumped together under the idea of data control keywords. This is where you can either grant or revoke permissions for people in the database. This is not an area we're going to cover in this course because that really gets into the specifics of things like the operating system and the authentication schemes that you're using for your particular database. So it's just not general content. You'll get into that for a specific database management system. But it's worthwhile to know that SQL itself is broken up into these larger categories of the different things you're likely to do with it. Most of your time manipulating data, some of the time defining the actual database itself, and a little bit of the time controlling who has access to different parts of it.